You say that traditional Native American values led them to fight for the Union. What values were these?
It was the values that basically had got them driven out of the Indian Territory. The Confederacy, when they imposed these treaties, you could look at the condition that Indians face and see this as sort of the cutting edge. Things that start getting done out in the Indian Territory will eventually be done across the country. For the Confederacy, when they established these treaties, every Indian male is subject to a military call-up at the order of the White House in Richmond, right? And this essentially is universal conscription for Indians. Now, you will get that in the white South eventually, but the Indians get it first. And no sooner than they try to implement this, but that all the Indian men who did not feel as though they had a stake in this simply head for the hills. So you have large concentrations. For example, the camp where Potliahola, the chief of the Creeks, winds up as many as 10,000 people camped out on his land under his protection as a chief, as a religious leader among the Creeks, as the Confederate Army is coming in to attack them. And that's what I mean by the traditional values creating the Unionism. Their resistance to the white South, their resistance to secession, their resistance to the idea that the people with wealth and power should be making decisions for their nation. That's what's going to drive them into exile.
There were slave-holding Indians.
Yes.
They were caught in a bind, I presume. And the blacks that were living amongst the Indians, were they mainly slaves, mainly not, marrying in? What was the? Those are all wonderfully interesting questions.
I thought so. The simplest answer is we don't know, because the life that blacks had among Indians was so diverse. It was so different. Among whites, it's not. And you can certainly find Indian slaveholders. For example, among the Choctaw down in the Red River, you can find Indians who are trying to set up plantations.
You're showing here
yes.
An African-American Seminole Indian.
Who's a chief.
Was a chief. So there really was, from the top to the bottom, from slavery to chiefdom, for the blacks that are within the Indian territories.
Absolutely. The slaveholders in Kansas, slaveholders not in Kansas, in Arkansas, Missouri, Texas, if you were in the business, you would not buy a slave from the Indian Territory because they just didn't know how to be a slave. When removal took place, the Indians and all their property was moved west. But if you were black and living among the Indians and you were not the property of an Indian, you were seized by the army and sold back into slavery. So at the time of removal, blacks who were living among the Seminoles, blacks who were living among the Creeks, any of these nations, would go to the chief and say, claim us as your property, claim us as a slave. So when we actually look at the record, we see a lot of slavery. I'm sure some of it was real, but I'm sure some of it was simply a legal fiction. In the Creek Nation, there were places like North Forktown, where you had entire towns that were predominantly black, self-governing.
Do you have any questions right here by chance? I forgot to tell you that you could ask questions if you wanted as well. Did the white refugees have any problems fighting along? Was it easier for them to fight alongside an Indian than a black?
I don't think that the actual soldiers, insofar as we know, someone like Wiley Britton, didn't seem to have any problem at all. And there are records of people from Arkansas and Texas who were engaged in this as well, who don't seem to have any problem. When the war continued, by the time you get to 1863 and 64, the Kansas press becomes notably hostile to Indians and friendly to blacks, and begins pitting blacks against Indians. It's good to fight alongside blacks. Blacks accept the rules of war. Blacks are behaving honorably on the battlefield. They obey the white officers. The Indians, you just don't know what they're going to do. And of course, the Indians had their own officers, and the Indian units were actually the only really racially mixed units officially in the war. We talk about the 54th Massachusetts, but in really a year before the attack on Battery Wagner, you have a battle in the Indian Territory where black soldiers in the Indian Home Guards are fighting. It's a mixed unit.
Tell me briefly, there's a lot in here as well that we're not being able to touch also, but very quickly, Richard Hinton is here and promulgated an idea for an expedition in the middle of this. Just fairly briefly, would you let us know what that was and how it became the basis for Lane later on for his expedition?
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because it's sort of, you look at it now and it seems almost fictional that somebody could actually see that. Texas had a lot of Germans, a lot of anti-slavery Germans, centered in the hill country, places like San Antonio. And going into the Civil War, many of them were talking about wanting to break Texas up into different states and establish part of Texas as a free state. So when Kansas is sort of settled, when they know that Kansas is going to be settled favorably, Hinton does this wonderful expedition we know about because he writes a report to John Brown. When John Brown's captured at Harper's Ferry, they find this report in his possession. Hinton takes a scouting expedition south on the area where they're going to be fighting the Civil War in just a few years, and looking among the Creeks for allies, looking among the Indian people who were there for allies, thinking that if you could stop slavery in Kansas, establish a barrier to slavery in the Indian Territory, and have a free state in Texas, you would establish a barrier beyond which slavery couldn't expand. You would have accomplished the goal of Lincoln and the Republican Party without a war.
Well, that's a fascinating fantasy that did not take place. Since we have a Kansas-born person behind the camera, I'm going to ask this question since he asked it. What do we know about the political opinions of the men who made up the 1st and 2nd Kansas colored regiments? Were they different, these regiments different from the colored units elsewhere in the nation?
They were very similar in some ways, different in others. Something like the 54th Massachusetts was considered, the pioneering regiment in the East. That was a showcase regiment, mostly free blacks. The 1st Kansas Colored was almost all runaway slaves. The leaders of the 1st Kansas Colored came originally mostly from the 5th Kansas Cavalry. This was part of one of Jim Lane's original regiments. They would go into Missouri and essentially apply the Emancipation Proclamation years before anybody thought it would be applied anywhere, and remove slaves en masse from counties in Missouri and hide them. And what happened was that the Union Army officials went after the officers in the 5th Kansas Cavalry, and they refused to cooperate with retrieving runaway slaves. And so they were all placed under house arrest. So most of the people who wind up in the leadership of the 1st Kansas Colored were people who were in serious hot water with the Army just a few months before. Things change, and these people who were breaking the law, breaking military regulations before, wind up getting charged with building a regiment of black refugees.
It's an interesting story that's probably not very well known. Well, we're coming to the end of our time here, unfortunately, but I've enjoyed this immensely. I want to tell you about some of the upcoming events at Virtual Book Signing. Just in a couple of weeks, July 24th, Saturday at noon, Lawrence Hewitt with 2 volumes of short biographies of Confederate generals in the Western Theater only. Fascinating 2 books. And Brian Craig Miller with his new work on John Bell Hood and the Fight for Civil War Memory, both from the University of Tennessee Press, and we thank them for sending them on. This fall, and if you sign up for our email list for updates as we book our authors, you'll know that they're coming. In October 9th, which is a Saturday at noon, Earl Hess with his new book on the Battle of the Crater. And we're hoping to have Elizabeth Leonard on her book on U.S. colored troops at the same time. But Earl Hess will certainly be here October 9th. On October 23rd, Jim Lander, Lincoln and Darwin, Shared Visions of Race, Science, and Religion. And also Dan Van Heften and David Hirsch on their shared book, Abraham Lincoln and the Structure of Reason. It's Lincoln's use of Euclid and understanding of Euclid in his legal career and political and presidency times as well. Fascinating book, I think you'll like. And October 30th, this is an important piece that we have coming in. Ron Chernow with his new book on Washington, A Life. And I don't think you're going to want to miss October 30th with Ron Chernow on George Washington. Well, we are so happy that University of Illinois Press brought in Mark Lause, Race and Radicalism in the Union Army. And there will be signed books available. We're going to put you to work right after this to sign some of them. We appreciate everyone who has already purchased and hope others will read this fascinating book as time goes on. Mark, again, thank you. Appreciate the staff at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop for their work here. And for everyone at Virtual Book Signing, thank you, and do stop by again.